Today I will read the Edgar Dijkstra goto statement. Consider the harmful. The goto statement considered harmful. Keywords and phrases. Goto statement, jump instruction, branch instruction, and conditional clause, alternative clause, and repetitive clause, and program intelligibility, and program sequencing. CR categories 4.2020, 5.5.23, and 4.24. Editor. A number of years, I have been familiar with the observation that quality of the programmers is a decreasing function of the density of the goto statements in the programs they produce. More recently, I discovered why the use of the goto statement has such a disastrous effect, and I became convinced that the goto statement should be abolished from all higher-level programming languages. That is, everything except, perhaps, plain machine code. At the time, I did not attach too much importance of this discovery. I know some in my consideration for publication because in very recent discussion in which subject turned up, I have been urged to do so. My first remark is that the although of the programmer's activity ends and when he has constructed a correct program, the process taking place under control of the programming is the true subject matter of his activity. For it is this process that has to accomplish that desired effect. It is this process that in its dynamic behavior has to satisfy that desired specification. Yet, once the program has been made, the making of the corresponding process is delegated to the machine. My second remark is that our intelligence powers are little geared to master static relations, and that our powers to visualize processes evolving in time are relatively poorly developed. For that reason, we should do, as wise programmers aware of our limitations, our utmost to shorten the conceptual gap between the static program and the dynamic process, to make the correspondence between the program spread out in the text space and the process spread out in the time as trivial as possible. Yeah. Let us now consider how we can characterize the progress of a process. You may think about this question in a very concrete manner. Suppose that a process, considered as a time succession of actions, is stopped after an arbitrary action. What data do we have to fix in order to what data what data do we what data do we have to fix to in order that we can redo the process until the very same point? If the program text is a pure concatenation of, say, assignment statement, for the purpose of this discussion regarded as descriptions of single actions, it is sufficient to point in the program text to a point between two successive action descriptions. In the absence of goto statements, I can permit myself the syntactic ambiguity in the last three words of a previous sentence. If we parse them as successive action descriptions, we mean successive in text space. If we parse as successive action descriptions, we mean successive in time. Let us call such a pointer to a suitable place in the texture index. So, when we include clauses if B then A, alternative clauses if B then A1 else A2, choice clauses as introduced by C.A.R or CAR for case I of A1, A2, and A_n, or condition expressions as introduced by J. McCarthy, B1, B2, E1, B1, E1, and Bn, En. The fact remains that the progress of the process remains characterized by a single texture index. As soon as we include in our language procedures, we must admit that a single texture index is no longer sufficient. In the case that a texture index points to the interior of a procedure body, the dynamic progress is only characterized when we also give to which call of the procedure we refer. With the conclusion, with the inclusion of a procedure, we can characterize the progress of a process via sequence of texture indices. The length of this sequence being equal to dynamic depth of a procedure calling. Let us now consider repetition clauses like while B repeated A or repeated A until B. Logically speaking, such clauses are now superfluous because we can express repetition with the aid of recursive procedures. For regions of realism, I don't wish to exclude them. On the one hand, repetition clauses can be implemented quite comfortably with present-day finite equipment. On the other hand, finite equipment. On the other hand, the listening pattern known as induction makes us well equipped to retain our intellectual grasp on the processes generated by repetition clauses. With the inclusion of repetition clauses, texture indices are no longer sufficient to describe the dynamic process of progress of a process. With each entry into a repetition clause, however, we can associate the so-called dynamic index, inexorably counting the ordinal number of the corresponding current repetition. As repetition clauses, just as procedural calls, may be applied nastily, we find that now the progress of a process can always be uniquely characterized by a mixed sequence of texture and or dynamic indices. The main point is the values of these indices are outside of programmer's control. They are generated either by the write-up of his program or by the dynamic evolution of the process, whether he wishes or not. They provide independent coordinates in which to describe the progress of the process. Hmm? Why do we need independent coordinates? The reason is, and this seems to be inherent to sequential processes, that we can interpret the value of a variable only with respect to the progress of the process. If we wish to count the number n, say, of people in an initial empty room, we can achieve this by increasing n by 1 whenever we see someone entering the room. In the bit in the in-between moment that we have observed someone entering the room but have not performed the subsequent increase of n each value equal to the number of people in the minus one in the room minus one. The unbridled use of the goto statement has an immediate consequence that it becomes terribly hard to find a meaningful set of coordinates in which to describe the process progress. Usually, people take in account as well the values of some well-chosen variables, but this is out of the question because it is relatively to progress the meaning of these values is to be understood. With go to the statement one can, of course, still describe the progress uniquely by a counting the number of the actions performed since the start program, which a kind of a normalized clock. The difficulty is that such a coordinate, although unique, is only unhelpful. In such a coordinate system, it becomes an extremely complicated affair to define all those points of progress where, say, n equals the number of persons in the room minus 1. Next paragraph. The go-to statement as it stands, it is just too primitive. It is too much an invitation to make a mess of one's program. One can regard and appreciate the clauses considered as bridling its use. I do not claim that the clauses mentioned are exhaustive in the sense that they will satisfy our needs. But whatever clauses suggest is, for example, abortion clauses, they should satisfy the requirement that a programmer independent coordinate system can be maintained to describe the process in a helpful and manageable way. It is hard to end with this fair acknowledgement. Am I to judge by whom by my thinking has been influenced? It is fairly obvious that I'm not influenced by Peter Landin and Christopher Strachey. Finally, I should like to record, as I remember it quite distinctly, how Heinz Zemmour ended a pre-Argo meeting in early 1959 in Copenhagen quite explicitly expressed his doubts whether the go-to statement should be treated on equal syntactic footing with the assignment statement. To a modest extent, I blame myself for not having then drawn the consequences of his remark. The remark about the undesirability of the go-to statement is far from new. I remember having read the explicit recommendation to restrict the use of go-to statement to all languages, but I've not been able to trace it. Presumably, it has been made by CARHORS in 1SC3.2.1. Wolf and Horse together make a remark in the same direction in motivating the case structure. Like the conditioner, it mirrors the dynamic structure of a program more clearly than goto statements and switches, and it eliminates the need for introducing a large number of labels in the program. Into the Guinness Guys P. J. Company seems to have proved the logical superfluousness of the go-to statement. The exercise to translate an arbitrary flow diagram more or less mechanically into a jumbless one, however, is not to be recommended. Then the resulting flow diagram cannot be expected to be more transparent than the original one. Thank you.